Richard wasn't the kind of man who startled easily. He had spent most of his life working in cemeteries, and while he had heard countless stories about shadows, apparitions, and strange noises, he never gave them much thought. He believed in logic, in written records, and in the mental fatigue that sometimes tricks perception. But all of that began to shift during his most recent job at a small, remote cemetery in the northern part of Oregon. He ended up there out of necessity. After months of unemployment, the site's manager, an older man named Mr. Whitaker, offered him the night caretaker position. The pay was modest, but it came with a small room tucked behind the main office. Richard accepted without asking many questions. He was quiet, private, and didn't owe explanations to anyone. At first, the routine was just as uneventful as he had expected. His nightly rounds involved checking that the gates were locked, making sure there were no signs of vandalism or animals disturbing the graves. He appreciated the solitude. He would walk slowly with his flashlight among the headstones, sometimes stopping to watch the dew settle on the wilted flowers. There was a kind of beauty in that stillness. A strange beauty, yes, but comforting to someone who had endured so many personal losses. For weeks, nothing out of the ordinary happened. But one early morning changed everything. That night, as he passed a row of older graves, he noticed the soil on one of them seemed looser than usual. He didn't think much of it at the time. It had rained in recent days, and disturbed ground wasn't uncommon. Still, he made a mental note of it. The next day, he returned to the same spot. This time, the earth looked as though it had been dug up by hand. There were no footprints, no tools, just that unsettling feeling that something was off. Mr. Whitaker, as usual, showed no interest when Richard mentioned it. He just told him to keep a closer eye on things. Richard began to feel a growing unease. Not fear, not yet, but that subtle tension that settles in when the natural order of things is disturbed. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him, maybe not. That night, while preparing his thermos with coffee and checking his flashlight, he thought about all the stories he had ignored over the years. Tales he had dismissed as mere fantasy. And as he looked at his own weary reflection in the window glass, he whispered to himself, maybe this time it's real. If you're drawn to stories like this one, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments about the most terrifying experience you've ever had. But Richard wasn't looking for attention. He just wanted to understand what was beginning to unfold beneath his feet. From that night on, he couldn't help but return, again and again, to that same grave. It was old, unvisited, with no fresh flowers or signs of care. The marble was cracked and the name barely legible, and yet each time he passed by it, he felt something tighten inside him, like an invisible cord pulling him to pause, just for a moment. In the days that followed, he tried to make sense of it. He asked to see the cemetery's old records, which Mr. Whitaker kept locked away in a desk drawer. After some resistance, the man reluctantly agreed. According to the papers, the grave belonged to a man buried over 20 years ago. No living relatives, no recent visits, nothing out of the ordinary. On paper, Richard decided to take matters into his own hands. He gathered some large rocks and placed them carefully around the grave, not only to protect it, but to see if anyone tampered with it again. He documented everything, the exact position of the stones, the soil level, even the smallest irregularities. That night, he struggled to sleep. Something was bothering him like a cold draft sneaking under the door. At dawn, he rushed straight to the grave. The rocks had been moved, not scattered, just out of place. A few looked hastily shoved aside. Still, there were no prints, no shovel marks, just disturbed soil, slightly deeper than the day before. His throat dried with unease. It wasn't a sudden, sharp fear, but the slow-building kind that presses down on your chest. He knelt down, touched the ground, tried to find a rational explanation. There was none. That night, he decided watching wasn't enough anymore. He would have to hide. He waited until the last hint of daylight vanished. Then he packed an extra flashlight battery, a bottle of water, and a small notebook. He crouched behind a nearby mausoleum, a spot that gave him a clear view of the grave without being seen. He stayed there, tense and alert, heart beating like a muffled drum. For nearly 2 hours, nothing happened, just the occasional crack of a branch, the murmur of trees, and the quiet hum of insects. It was sometime after 2 a.m. when Richard noticed it. The atmosphere shifted. The silence grew heavier, like the air itself had stopped moving. Then he saw it, a figure crouched by the grave, its hands digging into the soil. He didn't react right away. He thought it might be a lost visitor, maybe even a thief. But something was off about the frantic, relentless movement. He watched silently, flashlight off, struggling to keep his thoughts from spiraling. The figure looked like a child, thin, dirty clothes, unkempt hair. But there was more. The way it moved wasn't normal. No hesitation, no pauses, just a steady, mechanical rhythm, as if it knew exactly what it wanted. When Richard slowly straightened to get a better look, without making a sound, the figure froze. It didn't turn. It didn't run. It just stopped. That was when Richard felt it, something watching him, not from the grave, from behind. He spun around, flashlight ready, but there was no one. Just shadows cast over cold tombstones. When he turned back, the child was standing now, staring straight at him, head slightly tilted. Its face was pale, almost grey, and the eyes were pitch black. No reflection, no life behind them. Richard turned on the flashlight by instinct. The beam lit up part of the child's face, revealing an empty expression. Not fear, not surprise, just emptiness. As if its presence had no meaning, no reason. The caretaker swallowed hard and stepped forward. "Are you okay?" he asked, barely above a whisper. The child didn't answer. It simply lifted its dirt-covered hands and held them out toward him. A simple gesture, but deeply disturbing, as if it was trying to show him something unseen, as if it expected him to understand. Richard stepped back, torn between running and getting closer. There was no logic in what he was witnessing, and yet it all felt real, tangible, like this wasn't just a hallucination. When he spoke again, his voice shook. "Where are your parents? What are you doing out here?" The child slowly lowered its arms, took a step back, then another, still staring. Then, without warning, it spun and sprinted into the graveyard, disappearing between tombstones with a speed that didn't seem human. Richard hesitated, then chased after it, flashlight bouncing in his hand. He ran past graves and rusted crosses, but there was no sign of the child. Only wind, silence, and that unbearable sense that he had just witnessed something far beyond explanation. He returned to his room trembling, locked the door, turned off the light, sat on the bed in a daze. What haunted him most wasn't the fact that he had seen a child. It was the way that thing had looked at him, like it already knew him, like it had been waiting for him. The next morning brought with it a heavy silence. Richard tried to stick to his usual routine, but every movement was filled with tension. He made coffee but didn't drink it. He sat by the cemetery gate staring into the trees, as if daylight might somehow explain what had happened the night before. But nothing brought relief from the weight pressing on him. Later, just after noon, he decided to talk to Jeremy, the young man who handled the morning cleanup. He wasn't sure how to bring it up, so he started carefully. "Have you ever seen anyone wandering around here at night?" Jeremy glanced at him with curiosity, then gave a half-hearted smile. "Sometimes I hear weird stuff, but I've never actually seen anything. Why?" Richard hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Last night I saw a kid. He was digging up a grave with his bare hands." Jeremy's expression changed immediately. No more smile, just a tense look, as if those words had unearthed something he preferred not to think about. "No kids have been buried here in years," he said softly. "And definitely not in that part of the cemetery." Richard nodded. Not because he needed confirmation, but because he needed to know he wasn't losing his mind. That one comment confirmed something was wrong. So as dusk fell, he went straight to the main office, where Mr. Whitaker usually spent his time reviewing old documents. He knocked firmly on the door. "I need to see the oldest burial records." Mr. Whitaker frowned. "What for?" "The soil on one of the graves keeps getting disturbed, and there are things that don't add up." The older man stared at him for a moment, then reluctantly got up and opened a rusted metal drawer. He allowed Richard to look through the files, but stayed close, as if afraid he might uncover too much. The records were old, the ink faded with moisture. Richard searched for anything, names, dates, small notes. That's when he found it, a card labeled Ephraim Rowe, Plot 31A, 1994. Nothing more. No age, no family ties, no record of visits in decades. "Does this name ring a bell?" he asked, holding up the card. Mr. Whitaker gave it a passing glance and shook his head. "Too long ago. Some graves. People just forget." But Richard knew that was the one. The same grave he had seen the boy at. He recognized the number etched in the marble, and that tiny detail set off something deep inside him. That night, as he resumed his patrol, he walked silently to that area. What he saw made his chest tighten. A single, small, barefoot footprint pressed into the damp soil in front of Ephraim's grave. Just one, no others nearby, just that, as if someone had simply appeared there and vanished. Richard stood still, staring at the print. It wasn't deep or large, but its presence was undeniable. He crouched, ran his fingers along the edges, confirming what he already feared. It was fresh. The soil was still moist, as if the foot had pressed down only minutes ago. He looked around. Nothing. The cemetery was as silent as ever. But something in the air was different that night. Heavier, not cold, but something else. A subtle pressure in the chest, as though the ground itself was warning him to leave. Still, he stayed. He remained by Ephraim Rowe's grave, trying to understand what was binding him to that plot of land. Why him? Why now? He turned on his flashlight and searched the area again. No more prints, no marks, no sign of anyone. But the grave. The soil was disturbed again, not dug up, but as if someone had desperately been searching just beneath the surface. That thought haunted him. What was the figure trying to find? And why always that same grave? He returned to the mausoleum and sat in the shadows. Not to hide this time, but to wait. He needed to know if it would happen again. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable. 2 hours passed, then 3. Just as he was about to give up, he heard it, a soft crack. Then another. Richard turned off the flashlight and held his breath. The sound came from a familiar direction. As he peeked from behind the stone wall, his heart began to race. There it was, crouched again, digging, this time more frantically, with trembling hands. The figure looked thinner, paler. Richard wanted to call out, but something inside warned him not to. He took a step forward instead, slowly, without turning on the light. When he was only a few feet away, he saw the boy was holding something. A small object, covered in dirt. It was hard to tell what it was, but the child clutched it tightly, as if it belonged to him. Suddenly, as if sensing Richard's presence, he froze. He turned his head slowly, and there it was again. That stare, those black, hollow eyes, that lifeless expression, as if nothing in the world reflected in his gaze. Richard stepped back. The boy said nothing. He stood up, still holding the object. Then, in a motion too quick to be natural, he dropped it into the grave, looked at Richard once more, and ran, vanishing between the tombstones without a trace. Richard approached, legs shaking, and searched the loose soil. It was a small, worn leather shoe, old-fashioned, cracked with age. Inside was a hand-stitched tag with a name, Ephraim Rowe. He held the shoe in trembling hands. It was so small, so real, that there was no room for doubt. This wasn't some hallucination. He placed it gently on the headstone and stepped back, his eyes fixed on the grave. Everything pointed to a story buried for decades, forgotten by all. Back in his room, he couldn't sleep. The boy's face, the frantic digging, the shoe, all of it spun in his mind like a storm with no end. He tried to write it down, to record dates, details, sounds, but nothing came together. Every word he scribbled pushed him further from understanding. The next day, he avoided both Jeremy and Mr. Whitaker. He didn't want questions, didn't want to be dismissed as delusional. He left the cemetery for a few hours, wandered through town just to breathe different air. It was in a corner store, while ordering coffee, that he overheard a conversation between two elderly women sitting near the entrance. "Remember the Roe boy? Disappeared back in the 90s. They never found the body." Richard's stomach tightened. He pretended to check his phone, but couldn't stop listening. Yeah, his mom used to come to the cemetery every Sunday, even though there wasn't a grave. She said his soul couldn't rest, poor thing. And the father, no one ever saw him again. That was all he needed. No more proof. The name, the disappearance, the mother mourning a grave that never existed. It all made a macabre kind of sense. He left without finishing his coffee, throat tight. One thought running through his mind: he had to talk to Mr. Whitaker. The silence couldn't go on. He found him at his desk as usual, shuffling through old papers. Without a word, Richard set the shoe on the table. "I found this last night, at Ephraim Rowe's grave." The administrator stared at it, serious, unsurprised. "Where exactly?" "Right where the soil keeps moving, where that boy digs every night." There was a long silence. Mr. Whitaker slowly stood, picked up the shoe, turned it over a few times, then placed it back down. "Some things are better left alone, Richard. You knew, didn't you? What I know doesn't change what happens out there." Richard clenched his fists. Then why is he buried with no record? Why is there no official document? Why does his name appear on a headstone when the body was never found? Mr. Whitaker didn't answer. He took the shoe, slipped it into a brown paper bag, and said quietly, "If you want to keep your peace, forget what you saw. It wasn't your fault." Richard walked out with more questions than answers. And that night, as he resumed his patrol, he felt it. Beneath his boots, the earth no longer lay silent. It was breathing. That night, the cemetery felt different. Everything was still in its place, the headstones, the trees, the walls surrounding it. But Richard sensed the space had changed. It was as if the very ground pulsed beneath his steps. Every noise, no matter how faint, made him pause. Every shadow made him look twice. He returned to Ephraim Rowe's grave. The soil had been disturbed again, not violently, but with the care of someone searching, not to destroy, but to recover. The shoe was gone, but Richard didn't need it. What unsettled him now was something deeper. The thought that maybe, just maybe, the boy hadn't been searching for an object. He had been looking for something he was denied for years. The night dragged on. At around 2 a.m., while inspecting a corner of the cemetery, Richard heard the creak of an old gate in the distance. He ran toward the entrance, but the main gate was still locked with its padlock. He circled the perimeter. No one. Just the same crushing silence and the unshakable feeling of being watched. He returned to the old section, and as he turned a corner between tall headstones, he saw it. Not the boy this time, a taller figure, gaunt, clothes torn, head tilted at an unnatural angle. It stood just a few yards from Ephraim's grave, unmoving, not even breathing. Richard froze, unable to step back. The figure slowly raised its face. Its eyes were hollow, lifeless like the boy's, but something more lingered in them. Resentment, waiting. Richard tried to step away, but his body wouldn't obey. He was paralyzed, trapped in a wave of terror and something else. A strange sense of recognition. He didn't know this figure, and yet somewhere deep inside, he knew it was tied to the story no one wanted to tell. Suddenly, the figure spoke. Its voice was dry and low, as if rising from the bottom of a deep well. "This is not where I'm supposed to be." Richard could barely get a word out. "Who are you?" but there was no answer. The figure simply stepped back and vanished into the shadows as if carried off by the wind. Richard stood alone, that single sentence drilling into his mind. This is not where I'm supposed to be. He returned to his room trembling, locked the door, and turned on every light. He sifted through old notes and copies of burial records, details that had once seemed unimportant. That's when he spotted something he had overlooked. The name of a man, Lawrence Rowe, buried in an unmarked grave, with no exact date, just a short note. Remains relocated. That night, Richard didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, staring at his notes, sensing that piece by piece, something was beginning to unfold, but the darkest part had yet to come. Morning arrived without him ever closing his eyes. Daylight didn't ease the tension. In fact, everything felt even more unsettling under the sun. He reread the note about Lawrence Rowe again and again, wondering why someone would be buried without a location, without a proper date, and with such a vague remark. He couldn't ignore the last name, Rowe, the same as Ephraim. Was Lawrence his father, a close relative? If the boy had disappeared without a trace and the father had been buried in an unmarked grave, what kind of story was hidden beneath all this? He spent the day asking questions around town, visited the corner store, wandered through the plaza, and eventually reached the municipal library. There, he found a worn-out edition of the local newspaper from 1994. In a small, nearly forgotten column at the edge of a page, he read, "Minor missing in the Elwood district. His father, Lawrence Rowe, has been questioned. Authorities are considering all possibilities." Richard swallowed hard. There were no further details, no follow-up, no resolution. He returned to the cemetery that evening with only one certainty. This wasn't a coincidence. The boy wasn't appearing for no reason. He was seeking something, justice or perhaps rest. That night, as his shift began, Richard felt different, not afraid, resigned, as if he understood there was no turning back. He walked straight to Ephraim's grave. The soil was more disturbed than ever. It looked like someone, or something, had clawed at it in a frenzy. No tools, just uneven marks, as if fingernails had torn into the earth. And in the center, a hole no more than 8 inches deep, as if something had been unearthed. Richard turned on his flashlight and crouched down. Inside the hole was a crumpled, damp sheet of paper. He gently pulled it out and unfolded it. It wasn't official, just a handwritten letter, its ink smudged by time. The message was faint but readable. "Forgive me, son. I couldn't stop them. They made me stay silent. I can't carry this anymore." No signature. Richard felt his stomach twist. He clenched the note in his hands. Now, he understood. What the child had been searching for wasn't an object. It was the truth. A truth someone had tried to bury forever. He returned to his room and laid the letter on the table, sat in the darkness. He was no longer a bystander. Now, he was part of the story. And as he tried to process everything, a sharp sound pulled him out of his daze. A knock, coming from inside the cemetery. He stood up immediately, grabbed his flashlight, opened the door, and stepped out. The knocking came again. It wasn't random. It was steady, like hammering, or like someone pounding wood from the inside. From inside a coffin. Richard moved with careful steps, but inside he was trembling. The sound continued, rhythmic. Knock, pause, knock, like a message from beneath the ground, certain someone above could hear. His flashlight wavered between the graves. The battery was fading, right when he needed it most. Still, his mind was focused. He no longer wanted to run. He wanted answers, even painful ones. As he rounded a row of cypress trees near the oldest section of the cemetery, the knocking stopped. So did Richard. The silence was complete. He aimed his flashlight at Ephraim Rowe's grave. The soil was in disarray, as if a storm had struck only that plot. And there, amid the mess, something stood out. The headstone had been pushed aside, as though from the inside, which should have been impossible. Richard approached slowly, dragging his feet. No one else was around. He knelt down and shone the light into the grave. That's when he saw it. The coffin, rotted by decades of moisture, was slightly ajar. Not wide open, but just enough for him to see a hand, a small hand, motionless. His heart skipped a beat. For a second, he didn't know if what he saw was real or the result of exhaustion. He brought the flashlight closer. The hand was there, pale, thin, dry, but intact. Too intact for something that had spent 30 years underground. He felt the urge to do something, call the police, report it, alert someone, but his body wouldn't move. Fear gripped him by the throat. Then he sensed someone beside him. He hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't seen movement, but he knew someone was standing just to his right. He turned slowly. It was the tall man, the same one from before, Lawrence, the father. His eyes were sunken, skin like thin parchment, and his expression was filled with unbearable sorrow. He didn't speak at first. He just looked down into the grave. Then, barely audible, he whispered, "I couldn't protect him." Richard swallowed hard. He didn't know if he was speaking to a ghost, a living memory, or a guilt so old it had taken shape. But in that moment, everything became clear. The boy wasn't trying to escape. He wanted to be found. Lawrence stepped toward the grave, and just as Richard's flashlight died completely, the man vanished. Darkness swallowed everything. And in that last moment, all Richard heard was a child's voice, soft, barely a whisper in the dark. "Thank you." When the light went out, Richard stood frozen in place, his breath shallow and heart pounding, like it would tear through his chest. He didn't dare move, not out of fear of what he might see, but out of fear of breaking something sacred. The silence around him felt like glass ready to shatter. The child's whisper still echoed in his mind. "Thank you." Just one word, spoken gently yet loaded with centuries of sorrow. Richard realized then the boy hadn't wanted to frighten him. He had only needed someone to listen. He remained at the grave until the first ray of sunlight filtered through the trees. He had no idea how much time had passed. His body trembled from cold, from fatigue, from everything. He returned to his room without saying a word, locked the door twice, didn't turn on the lights, sat on the bed, staring at his dirt-covered hands. He stayed silent all day, didn't go out, didn't eat, didn't respond when Jeremy knocked. And when night came, he didn't show up for his shift. He couldn't. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. At sunrise the next day, he went straight to Mr. Whitaker's office, handed over the keys, his uniform, and a sealed envelope containing a letter he'd written in the early hours. He didn't speak, just looked at the man with tired eyes, both of them knowing nothing else needed to be said. That same morning, he left the cemetery, took a bus heading nowhere specific, and got off in a small town in northern Montana. He rented a modest room with what little money he had. He wasn't looking to start over. He just wanted distance from the ground that held so many secrets. Weeks passed, then months. And though life moved on, Richard never stepped into a cemetery again. He couldn't. Some nights, especially the cold ones, he'd wake up with the sensation of being back there, standing at that grave, watching the boy dig desperately, hearing the muffled knocks, the tight breaths, the presence at his side. He never told the story again. Not because he didn't want to, but because no one would ever understand it like he did. What he lived through wasn't a ghost story. It was an old mistake, an unresolved grief, a truth buried that refused to die quietly. But even now, when he sees a child running down the street, sometimes his body turns cold, because for a fleeting moment, in the blink of an eye, he thinks he sees those dark eyes again, that empty stare, and a voice, soft, unseen, whispers from memory, "I'm not alone anymore." And that, though he can't explain why, is what frightens him most.